In the small Belgian town of Pepinster, heavy machinery finishes what the floodwaters started.
This situation, it's difficult for me.
Camille Bribois knows his home is next. It's the only house he's ever known.
I am sentimental and emotional. I was born in this house on December 5th, 1946.
It's pain that was shared across Belgium and Germany this summer, where catastrophic floods killed more than 200. 6,000 miles away in the Philippines, 61-year-old Luzviminda Teson fears she and her family will face a similar fate. Their home swept away in a flood.
The monsoon rains are terrifying, so we decided to evacuate early. In the last typhoon, it was difficult to get out. This time, we didn't want the waters to rise and be caught in it again.
We found in Mr. Moss a soul.
Across the Pacific Ocean that same month, friends gathered in Olympia, Washington to mourn the death of Barnett Moss, one of the hundreds who died in a brutal heat wave.
I brought extra water and implored him to drink it. I could tell he was gravely affected by the heat.
Just south of them, on the same coast in the same summer, the Caldor fire took Chris Sheehan's home.
Everything that we owned, everything that we've built is gone. The only thing that's left standing is a chimney.
4 lives among millions more distorted and lost this year alone from the impacts of climate change. A warming atmosphere isn't the sole cause of these disasters, but the evidence grows clearer every day that fossil fuel emissions make these calamities more frequent, more severe, more deadly.
I'm delighted that so many of you have joined us here in Glasgow.
This is what's facing leaders and negotiators from nearly 200 countries over the next 2 weeks in Glasgow. Can those emissions be curtailed? And can it be done in time to avoid the worst outcomes of climate change?
There's just a huge amount at stake this fall. It's almost hard to put into words because the burden on these policymakers could not be any greater.
Dr. Kim Cobb is a climate scientist at the Georgia Institute of Technology. She was one of the lead authors on a recent UN climate report, which showed emissions rising much faster than previously known. She says these COP26 negotiations could be historic.
This is something that is a clarion call for our generation and future generations for centuries to come. Really, we're going to be deciding what futures we're bringing down upon ourselves, largely over the next decade, and in part that can be distilled to this most historic year of international ambition, or lack thereof.
Back in 2015, in the Paris Agreement, 196 nations pledged to reduce their emissions enough to keep warming below an additional 2 degrees Celsius compared to the pre-industrial era. The planet has already warmed over 1 degree since the 19th century. The hope in Paris was to keep warming to just 1.5 degrees. Beyond that threshold, scientists say the punishing and lethal effects of climate change will only get worse. Here's how, back in 2015, Princeton University's Michael Oppenheimer stressed the urgency.
If we don't start with rapid emissions reductions and substantial emissions reductions, that will pass a danger point beyond which the consequences for many people and countries on Earth will simply become unacceptable and eventually disastrous.
At the conclusion of the Paris talks, President Obama expressed optimism that the world understood the severity of the crisis and was acting.
I think we're going to solve it. I think the issue is just going to be the pace and how much damage is done before we are able to fully apply the brakes.
But in the 6 years since, the world has only stepped on the gas. Apart from a brief dip during the early days of the pandemic, global emissions have continued to set records. More than half of all the carbon that's been put in the atmosphere was done in just the last 30 years. Global temperatures have also continued to rise. The last 7 years have been the warmest 7 years on record.
It's time to say enough. Enough of brutalizing biodiversity. Enough of killing ourselves with carbon. Enough of treating nature like a toilet. Enough of burning and drilling and mining our way deeper. We are digging our own graves.
A report released by the UN last week said that at this pace, the world will blow past those Paris targets and hit 2.7 degrees Celsius of warming by the end of the century.
It's really important to realize just how little we have tipped the scales in our global climate system and how these have translated into devastating effects we're seeing today. We have warmed 1.1 degrees Celsius since the pre-industrial era. To double or triple the kinds of impacts that we're seeing, that's a 2 or 3 degrees Celsius world. And that is not a world that would be remotely recognizable to those of us sitting here today, already reeling from the effects of a 1.1 degrees Celsius world.
Unrecognizable to us.
Yes.
Right now, climate change is forcing massive migrations. One recent analysis said climate-related events drive twice as many people from their homes as war and violence. 2 weeks ago, the Pentagon, the White House, DHS, and the Director of National Intelligence all echoed this concern that, quote, the climate crisis is reshaping our world and that these migrations could trigger political instability and conflict. Providing aid to these vulnerable nations will be another main topic in Glasgow. The world's major polluters have failed to fully deliver a promised $100 billion yearly fund to help these countries adapt and survive in a
to give strong commitments to reduce emissions by 2030.
As negotiators in Glasgow hope to forge the safest possible future, those on the front lines continue to suffer the very ugly present of a warming world.